So the topic of my research is organizational sense making and identification and systematic literature review and emerging themes for strategic research. So the COVID-19 for the organizational system was an external shock. And in this moment, the organization needed to implement some mitigation measures to contain the impact of the COVID-19. These measures generate some changes in the managerial practices and also some changes in the identification of employees once they needed to adapt for a new organizational reality. In this context, the sensemaking played a crucial role for this process of adaptation of employees to this new organizational reality. So, how can we deal with the issues generated by this external shock? The COVID-19 is an example of an external shock that generates some disruptions in the sense making so far. And we want to understand a little bit better. So the objective of our research is to describe how sense making practices can influence organizational identification across organizational change. For it, we're going to do a systematic literature review to analyze the current state of the research that correlates sense making and organizational identification. The sense making approach two perspectives: retrospect, retrospective thinking, looking to make sense the past events that occurred, and the prospective thinking, tracing perspective for a probable future. And this fact make the literature really rich and really vast, which approach different perspectives such as the process of sense making in organization, the relevance of sense making in strategic changes, the design thinking and innovation, and the process of organizational learning. But what is sense making? Sense making comes from the idea that the reality is an ongoing accomplishment that takes form when people make a retrospective sense of the situations in which they find themselves and their creation. And sense making and sense giving they play a crucial role in the institutionalization. Once the sense making works creating meaning, in the construction of meaning, to develop a framework for understanding the nature of strategic change, and the sense giving is the process to influence this sense making to redefine the organizational reality. So for this work, we're going to understand organizational sense making as the social process of organizations to interpret the environment through interactions and permit to develop a collective comprehension and action. And what is identification? The identification is the extent of a collective and role defining essence as a self-defining. So is the is the incorporation of attributes in the self of the individual. And the organizational identification is the cognitive link of these attributes that are incorporated in the self and the organizational definition. And the organization identity and the personal identity, they have like a they have different behaviors which can be described in four kinds of identification: a strong identification, a strong disidentification, an ambivalent identification, and a neutral identification. Some authors have explained this model, showing that strong identification is when the personal values and the personal attributes they match with the organizational identity. A neutral is when they don't match, but they are not really different, like they are not opposite to each other. The ambivalent identification is when they match partially, and the strong disidentification is when they are 100% different. So why we are talking about shocks and organizational change? Why? We we know the literature of sense making, we know the literature of organizational identification, but the interaction, the link of these two perspectives, the literature that links these two perspectives is relatively limited. But one perspective that links those two literatures is the sense giving. Because through the sense giving, there is a narrative, there is a particular frame around values in the hope of the people identify with the managerial narrative. So this new frame of sense offers a new way of an individual identify with the company. How does it work? So the managerial sense making takes a place, and through this managerial sense making, he makes a decision. After he makes the decision, he announces the decision, it becomes public. And this public sense making, or as we call the sense giving, more or less implicitly, there is some value positions that shows what is the organizational really cares about. One example that we can see is Elon Musk talking about remote work when he posted that the employees should pretend to work somewhere to pretend to work somewhere else, or some of them that don't want to come back to the office cannot remain in the company, and start to fire also employees that were criticizing here. What was the effect? The effect, for example, a massive drop in revenue because they could tell that the environment was toxic, and some employees were saying that they were like feeling, they were with fear. Some of them, they were like complaining in the internet, saying like a brutalist decision maker that is no idea what he's doing, and he's saying that this cause of management was causing stress. And a researcher, Trace Bauer, she wrote a paper for Forbes saying that some the employees normally they were failing in the sense giving process because they were failing to provide a why, to provide choice, to provide guardrails, to provide the importance to come back to the office, to provide the support for the transition. And a great moment of shock, during the moment of a shock, the people inside of the organization need to make sense of this situation in a different way because it might affect the organizational identification. And we could tell that the previous literature still hasn't explored this phenomenon. We have made a previous analysis for the literature to understand external shocks, sense making, organization identification, but we want to go beyond because there is a lot to be explored in the literature. So we made a previous analysis, and this previous observation, we were looking some terms related to organizational identification and sense making, as is written here in the slide. And that is, we found 179 documents. And in these documents, we could tell the organizational identity is dependent on the process of making sense within the organization. And in this previous data collection they presented that the sense making as a crucial tool for organizations to have their identity spread to all the members. And the literature shows two contexts that this process happens: in the organizational sense giving to build a commitment, and the organizational change. The organizational sense giving to build a commitment. So there is some personal attributes and organizational attributes, such as is presented here, and they build the organizational context. After that, in the organizational context, the organization builds a sense making to fill up some gaps that the individual can have, and which this sense make builds organizational identity. The organizational identity interacts directly with the personal values through the sense giving to build a commitment. But when it happens a external shock, there is some differences in the process because across this external shock, the organization needs to build a strategic sense making to fill up new gaps that the individuals have. And this we call a crisis moment, which they are building still new organizational practices that are interacting with the personal values of the employees through the sense giving. This interaction builds an organizational change aiming to reach an strategic expectation, which the organization will have a new identity, and through the acculturation, they will develop the individuals will develop new professional values. And how is the discussion with the strategic literature? We plan to develop a global theoretical framework that describes the relevance of the sense making for the organizational identification in this context, and the applicability of this research can approach themes related to three moments for the organization: the moment of the external shock, the moment of the crisis, as we said before, and the moment of organizational practices change. And this study aims to provide three contributions to strategic literature: the creation of a global framework that describes the sense-making practices to build organizational identification across organizational change, the formulation of theoretical propositions, and the identification of new research directions of organizational sense-making and identification. And here are some recommendations that I want to collect here in this presentation. If I am being so narrow or so broad to express my result, how can I structure my analysis, how can I present the results, topics that I can link in literature recommendations. Thank you.